Hello Year 10 and welcome to your first in a series of poetry lectures based on the remaining poems in our Power and Conflict anthology. In these lectures we're going to be going through some of the language, imagery, context on each of the poems that we have left to study together. You'll be asked or possibly be asked to answer some questions as well as complete annotations of each of the poems. The idea behind this is so that you have some understanding of the poem that we are studying before you come to our lesson. It also allows us to utilise some of the technology and independent learning techniques that you are now all so good at. In today's lecture, we're going to be looking at the poem War Photographer by Carol Ann Duffy. You'll find it on page 41 of your anthology. You will obviously need a copy of the poem today, either from the anthology or on a sheet of paper, and then a pen and pencil to make some annotations. So as we know, the context around each of the poems is equally as important as our analysis and study of the language and words that are used in the poem. So we're going to be starting off by thinking about some of the reasons behind why Duffy wrote this poem. So Duffy was inspired to write this poem by a friendship she had with a couple of war photographers actually. She was especially intrigued by the very strange challenge that people like this faced, people whose job required them to record terrible, horrific events without being able to directly help the people they are recording. Duffy perhaps shares an affinity with these photojournalists. While they use photography to convey certain truths about the human condition, she uses words and language to do the same job. Throughout this poem, Duffy provokes us as readers to consider our own response when confronted with the photographs that we regularly see in newspaper supplements or online, and why so many of us have become desensitised to these images. By viewing this issue from the perspective of the photographer, she also attempts to look at the difficulties of such an occupation. By the end of the poem, it's really clear her subject in the poem, the person she's speaking about, straddles two very different worlds, and yet he feels like he belongs to neither of them. If we look at the poem's structure, the poem is laid out in 4 regular 6-line stanzas. Each stanza ends in a rhyming couplet. The poem's very rigid order contrasts with the chaotic, disturbing images described and experienced in the poem by the photographer. The rigid organisation mirrors the actions of the photographer, who lays out his films in ordered rows, as though in doing so he can in some way help to restore order in the chaotic world that he spends in his workplace. The poem moves through a series of observations in the first 3 stanzas, and in the 4th forms a sort of conclusion, an ending to the story. The style is almost cyclical and matter-of-fact, perhaps to imitate the clinical approach required by people in this line of work to allow them to actually do their jobs under such extreme pressure. Unlike the readers of the newspaper he works for and who he mentions, this sense of distance is a necessary requirement for him to do the job he does. Unsurprisingly, in a poem that is so focused on images of human suffering, Duffy concentrates on the sense of sight throughout the poem, and the final image is almost like a photograph itself, depicting the journalist surveying the landscape and the inhabitants below him impassively as he travels from England to his next war-torn environment. So before we go on to look at each individual stanza, let's read the poem through together. Notice that on the side of the slide here, I have included some key words from the poem. It's probably a good idea before you start making your individual stanza annotations that you make a note of these key words in your anthologies or in your books. War Photographer by Carol Ann Duffy. In his dark room, he is finally alone, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. The only light is red and softly glows, as though this were a church and he a priest preparing to intone a mass. Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh. All flesh is grass. He has a job to do. Solutions slop in trays beneath his hands, which did not tremble then, though seem to now. Rural England, home again to ordinary pain, which simple weather can dispel, to fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. Something is happening. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes. A half-formed ghost. He remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into a foreign dust. 100 agonies in black and white, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. From the aeroplane, he stares impassively at where he earns his living, and they do not care. Year 10, what I'd like you to do now that you've listened to a bit of the context, you've explored the structure, and we've read through the poem once, I'd like you at the top of your anthology, at the top of your poem, to write down 3 bullet points that would help you answer the question, what inspired Duffy to write this poem? So 3 bullet points at the top of your page that will help you summarise the context and the reasons behind the poet writing this poem. Do feel free to go back and listen again to the introduction and the context to be able to do this. So before I go into some individual annotations for you that I'd like you to copy into your own anthology, I'm going to talk quite broadly about each stanza so that we get a really good understanding of what's happening in the poem. So in stanza 1, the poem opens in the intimate, tranquil setting of the photographer's darkroom. For those of you that are used to digital photography, where you just plug a camera or a phone into a computer which downloads your images for you, that you can print them off, this is talking about the traditional way of processing film, which involves chemicals and a dark room. So the photographer in this poem is compared to a priest, and there is a definite sense of ritual in the way he develops his film. He sets out his film, spools of suffering, in ordered rows, perhaps in an attempt to restore order to the chaotic images contained within them. He handles the images with the same respect with which a priest would prepare for communion, and there is a definite spirituality to the process he is undertaking. This religious imagery throughout this stanza is effective in not only conveying the dedication the photographer feels towards his occupation, but also because, like a priest, he too is often exposed to death and suffering. The red light that is mentioned of the dark room has connotations of the light that burns continually in Catholic churches to symbolise the presence of Christ. It also has connotations of blood, a sight that the photographer must be all too familiar with. Aside from the function of the light to help process the films and protect the images that he has taken, there is more than a suggestion that the darkroom is a place of sanctuary for the photographer. Just as a religious or spiritual person may look for the same kind of solace in a church, had they been confronted with the same horrors that the photographer must endure day after day, week after week. However, instead of preparing for mass, the photographer is developing images of war, evidence of inhuman behaviour which only serves to contradict the basic teachings of the church. The final line of the stanza ends in a list of the places where he has recorded images of conflict. Duffy's deliberate use of full stops here helps to fix the images, the final part of the printing process, into the mind of the reader. The stanza ends with the quotation, "All flesh is grass." This phrase actually comes directly from the New Testament in the Bible and reinforces the religious imagery as well as emphasising how fragile and how short-lived life really is. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to look at stanza 1 and break it down into 4 or 5 annotations that I would like you to make in your anthologies, please. So let's start off, as we always do, with the date of this poem, and you can place this next to the title, War Photographer. So this poem was written in 1985. So let's go through the stanza itself. In his dark room he is finally alone, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. Spools of suffering is sibilance and really highlights the dark nature of the photos and their content. And again, we talked about this earlier, but they're set out in ordered rows. If we think about this, ordered rows, it's describing the films, the reels of film, and if you think about what else it could suggest, it may be like soldiers marching or war graves. But what it certainly does is it makes us see the paradox in chaos and suffering reduced to something really ordered. The only light is red and softly glows, as though this were a church and he a priest, preparing to intone a mass. So looking at that there, as though he were a church and he a priest, it's a simile. And we've mentioned the comparison of a priest and the photographer in terms of the sense that they have to deal with loss and they have to deal with death and they have to deal with comforting the people left behind. But this simile for me shows how serious he takes his work. It's a sense that it's a very solemn process. We've also then got a series of plosive sounds, priest preparing to intone a mass, and then in the next line, Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh. That B and the P sound is called a plosive and could be reminiscent of gunfire. And onto that list, broken up by those full stops, Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh. Belfast, Northern Ireland, Beirut in Lebanon, and Phnom Penh in Cambodia. They are all war zones across the world, where the war photographer actually lives, England, in contrast to those three places, is safe and calm. We talked about this last sentence, all flesh is grass, in the summary, but that is a biblical reference, meaning that human life is temporary. In stanza 2, this stanza breaks the calm of the dark room with the line, he has a job to do. The phrase solution slop in trays has two meanings, referring both directly to the onomatopoeic sound of the chemicals that he is using to develop, but also the hope that in some way these photographs may help to contribute to the resolution of the conflict that they depict. If we see the atrocities that are happening, perhaps more will be done to prevent them. Significantly, the photographer's hands are shaking, though they did not tremble when taking the photo. The implication here is that in order to function, to do his job properly in the field, the photographer must be able to remove himself from what he's seeing, the subject, the people, the families, the hurt, the agony. However, he is able to let down his guard in the privacy of his own dark room, and here he finally allows himself to react to some of the terrible suffering that he is forced to witness and record. So perhaps what we're seeing here, how his hands didn't shake when he was actually in the moment and how they are now, perhaps Duffy is commenting on a almost post-traumatic stress or a physical response to the horrors that he has seen. In this stanza, he considers the contrast between rural England and the war zones that he visits, noting how our ordinary problems can just sometimes go away by the simplicity of the weather. That is definitely true. The beautiful sunshine that we had this weekend really lifts and can brighten your spirits. But he finds this hard to deal with. The injustice of the situation that he experiences is almost exemplified when he notes how children in our country don't have to be fearful of landmines when they are out to play. One of the most iconic images of war photography is deliberately referenced in the final line of this stanza, of running children in a nightmare heat. The image is on the screen here. This photograph of children fleeing from a napalm attack in Vietnam directly helped to end this conflict and emphasises just how indifferent we have become today when similar images fail to resonate with us and we fail to do anything. Okay, then to look at stanza 2 into more detail. Again, remember adding these annotations to your anthology for me, please, as we go through. So here we go, stanza 2. He has a job to do. Solution slop in trays beneath his hands, which did not tremble then, though seem to now. Rural England, home again to ordinary pain, which simple weather can dispel, to fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. So the simple sentence that starts stanza 2, he has a job to do, full stop. It's very monosyllabic, meaning one syllable words. He has a job to do. As the job that he does suggests, he photographs, we talked about it earlier, inhuman acts of violence and death and hurt. And this sentence suggests that he has to put his emotions aside to complete and to do the job he does. If he didn't, then he would be even more affected by it than he is. Moving on, We've got rural England. The actual phrase itself there, rural England. Notice how it is the use of caesura there, breaking it up, sort of separating it very much from the world that he lives in, that he sees, making the reference that we've really got no idea what's going on. The actual phrase itself, though, sounds soft, safe, and contrasts very much with the places that are listed above in stanza 1. It talks about ordinary pain, which simple weather can dispel. And we will come back to this point when we look at a section in stanza 2. But it's that reference that we really just, the pain that we suffer is ordinary in comparison to the pain of war and conflict. Lots of our aches and pains, we can just go outside and often we kind of say, gosh, it was the weather that's made me feel so much better, and how simple that is as an idea in comparison to what some of the people and families and men and women and children that he has seen suffer so very much, and how that idea to them would just be completely alien. Home again to ordinary pain with simple weather can dispel, to fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. I mentioned this previously, but as you can see, I've put this image that is referenced here in line 12. Now this is reference to a very famous war photographer called Nick Ut, and it was titled Napalm Girl. And what you can see here is an image of a girl in pain running after being hit by a napalm attack. And what happened, this was during the Vietnam War, and what you can see here is all the small children running from their village, and a napalm bomb is a bomb designed to start fires, and it was these innocent children were a part of it, and the young girl there that's just running naked, her clothes have been burnt off of her, just screaming in agony. It's a horrific image to look at, but it has been sometimes credited as actually helping to end the war. This was almost the straw that broke the camel's back, in the sense that it made people do something. And this is kind of, it goes back to really Duffy's dilemma, I suppose, doesn't it? That, okay, the war photographer's role is massively emphasised here. A photo can end a war, but also it's that dilemma that she's that I think she's quite fascinated by, that you're behind a screen looking at this, and yet you can't do anything. You are restricted from doing anything in the moment, but actually if this photo gets published, you could be responsible for changing or ending the war. In stanza 3, the opening line, "Something is happening," injects drama and suspense into the poem and suggests the photographer, who is not wholly in control of the development process himself. Duffy allows us to see the horrific photograph develop before our eyes, like it would for the photographer himself. In this image that we see developing slowly, the photographer has captured the picture of a man in his dying moments, and he is described as a half-formed ghost. This description is dually effective, since it both describes the way the figure is gradually appearing on the paper, while also alluding to the fact that since he no longer exists, he has effectively become a ghost, and what the photographer has captured is that transition from man to ghost. The photographer talks about how he wasn't able to speak the language of the war-torn country that he was in, and because he was unable to speak the same language, he looked to seek approval through the unspoken exchange of looks with the victim's wife. Again, the analogy to a priest is effective here, as they, like this photographer, tend to people and people's families in their final moments. The impact of this memory on the photographer and his sensitivity in seeking permission to capture such an intimate moment on film is really clear and obvious to us. Just like a priest, he feels his job is a vocation, a calling, rather than a career, as he asserts he does what someone must, although he is aware of how intrusive his occupation is. He needs to make sure that he conducts himself with the utmost compassion and sensitivity. But I think it's important to reference now, going back to some of the original context, that this is a dilemma that Carol Ann Duffy wants us to focus on. She begs the question of us as a reader, and also in general for people who visit war-torn countries. It's that dilemma. I'm here to do my job. I need to take pictures. But the dilemma for the photographer is that they cannot intervene. They cannot stop something from happening or help somebody outside the realms of their job that they are there to do. This photographer can only just sit and watch horrific events happening in front of his very eyes. He cannot do anything about it. Okay, so stanza 3 then, again, remember that for each stanza that we go through, I'd like you to be making the annotations in your anthology ready for us looking at this in a bit more detail together in lessons. So we start off with a volta. Hopefully you are aware of what this term means, but essentially it is a change. Something is happening, full stop. Our focus switches to the personal cost of war, where we're going to now be, the narrative of the poem is going to change from where we've been to actually a specific death, and the photographer looking at his image developing in front of him. So actually something is happening here has got two meanings. So we've got this idea that there's things going on in the world that we aren't aware of because we're so happy at home, but also something is happening in front of him. He's starting to see the image of a man dying. It's starting to develop on the pages in front of him, and the chemicals are starting to do their job, and his photo is starting to emerge. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes, a half-formed ghost. So the focus here is on one family, emphasising the real impact that this has had on the photographer himself. It's a stranger. He doesn't know who this person is. And it also highlights how intrusive the war photographer's role is. He's in the middle of an incredibly personal moment between a family where the father, husband, is slowly passing away. We mentioned it earlier in the stanza 3 summary, but the adjective half-formed, that's referencing both the picture itself hasn't finished forming yet, but also suggests the mutilated body of the subject of the photo. He hasn't quite become a ghost yet, he hasn't quite died, but he's in the process of doing it. The other thing I'd like to just draw your attention to is this idea of someone's features faintly starting to twist. And I think that verb, twist, is one that packs a lot of emotion and violence. And if I think about the image of somebody in pain, your face does twist and distort, doesn't it, when you cry in pain and shriek out in pain. So that verb twist also serves a purpose in highlighting the pain and agony of what our photographer is seeing. He remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval without words to do what someone must. I think that goes back to the idea of our photographer being like that role of a priest or a religious man or person, in the sense that his role is almost like a vocation. It's not a job, it's not a day-to-day role. His role is so important. We saw that in the last stanza, that it could almost be credited by helping to end a war. But really, his basic role is more simple than that, and that is to inform us, the public, who are comfortably sitting in rural England, unaware of anything like this, unaware of such atrocities. He must do this. This is his role in life. It's his vocation. Then lastly, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. So it's that idea again that it's highlighting that this has happened somewhere else. It's foreign. It's not close to us as readers. It's not close to us as viewers of this image. It's somewhere far away. And I think this is a reference to the fact that we can often feel very affected by the images of war and violence that we see in the news, but ultimately the reality is, when it's so far removed from our day-to-day life, we just carry on with our daily business, don't we, once we've seen that image. And the poet Duffy comes onto that later in the last stanza. But the last thing I wanted to reference is the idea of how the blood has stained the foreign dust. A stain is something that can sometimes last forever. So it's that contrast again, isn't it? That for those people, that family of this man who the photographer has captured, this event will have a long-lasting, life-changing impact on them. They will be forever stained with this, with the loss of their father, their husband, with the impact of the violence and the ordeal that they have had to experience. So as Duffy comes to the end of the poem here, stanza 4, she brings us towards her conclusion, and she makes a comment on the way that these images are received by the people they are produced for, both referencing here the newspaper, magazine editors who commission the work, so pay for photographers to go out to these war-torn countries to send the photos back, and to us, the readers, the people that see these images in the newspapers or magazines or online publications. The 100 agonies that the photographer has selected for his editor contrasts immediately with the phrase, "we'll pick out 5 or 6 in the next line. The careless indifference in the way the editor selects the images reinforces how little regard we have for the subjects in the pictures. Duffy extends this disingenuous response to us, the readers of the newspapers, using something called bathos. That's basically like a anticlimax, when describing how our eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. The poem ends with the photographer departing once more for a new job as the cycle begins all over again. His sense of separateness from his countrymen is evident as he refers to us as they, emphasising how little he identifies with our normal, in inverted commas, lives and values. He looks down on the landscape of rural England from the aeroplane, and there is a growing acceptance that despite everything he does, all of his efforts, his photographs will ultimately make no real difference at all. So that brings us to the ending of this poem, stanza 4. 100 agonies in black and white, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. From the aeroplane, he stares impassively at where he earns his living, and they do not care. So there's quite a bit that we're going to take from this final stanza, and the first part of it is 100 agonies in black and white, and that is a really emotive metaphor that highlights the suffering that the hundreds of images show that he has painstakingly developed from his previous job. We've got the sibilance in that second, in line 20 there, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. And this causes the reader to almost spit out the words, doesn't it? From which his editor will pick out 5 or 6. It really makes us highlight those very few numbers in comparison to the 100 images that he presents to the editor. And we get the sense of frustration. What's the matter with all the other 100 photos? Why does the editor only pick these 5 or 6? Are they not considered important enough for the newspaper? It almost gets the impression as well that you feel that this photographer has suffered so very much himself and put himself in such dangerous situation for a newspaper editor to, in the comfort of his office and comfy office chair, only picks a couple of those photos to go into the Sunday supplement. Now, just in case you're not sure, a supplement is an addition to a newspaper. So it might be a magazine in the middle or part of the newspaper. But it's the fact that we're looking at these photos being put into a Sunday supplement. Could that be because the Duffy is trying to highlight what Sunday means to us? Traditionally speaking, a Sunday is a day of rest, isn't it? A day that you can relax before your working week or your school week starts all over again. Again, another reference to the people that the photographer has captured. Do they get a day of rest? Does war stop on a Sunday? No, it doesn't. Again, just highlighting how removed we are from the danger and the atrocity that he has experienced. Linking to this sense of us being totally removed from this situation and totally not being able to understand or empathise with both the photographer and the people that he has captured, the reader's eyeballs prick with tears. Now, if we talk about this feeling of pain, if your eyeballs prick, or if there was like a pinprick, it's a very short pain. It's not agony. It's a small pain that doesn't last for a very long time. Again, just kind of highlighting, the images that we see of war and conflict in newspapers, they do affect us. We do feel an emotional response to them. But once we've turned the page, or once we've got on with our day or moved on to a different conversation, or we've been distracted by something else happening, that sense of pain and anger or that sense of sadness goes away, doesn't it? In an instant, unlike the pain and suffering that we know earlier in Stanza 4 has stained the lives of those people. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. To further highlight the short duration of pain that we feel, we've got internal rhyme. Notice how the word tears rhymes with beers. So we've got that idea that the reader just gets on with their life, enjoyment of life, and easily forgets what they've seen. Now, in this last rhyming couplet, the last 2 lines of Stanza 4, we see our war photographer back out again onto the next adventure, but onto the next war zone, onto the next job. And it's that idea that war never stops. it's almost cyclical, the nature of the structure of this poem. It goes back again. He's back on an aeroplane, back out to a war zone, leaving rural England and the safe space behind. From the aeroplane, he stares impassively at where he earns his living. So what he's talking about there is he's returned to a war zone and he's looking down on it. And for him at this moment in time, he's so desensitized to it that he is looking at it impassively without really a worry or a concern. And it's just looking out at where he earns his living. And he highlights at the end there, they do not care. Now, I think the they is quite ambiguous. I think we can say quite a lot about it. We know that he feels very removed, the photographer, from two worlds that he lives in. I talked about it in the summary of him straddling two worlds. It's like he's a part of rural England, normal life, but he's also a part of the conflict. And in either place, he doesn't really have a role. He doesn't really have a place. So they, in that last four words of the poem, could mean the readers of the supplement. But more generally, I think it's a reference to the world, how we can be very apathetic, not bothered, not worried about the suffering that is going on in the world around us. And sometimes we can just forget our place in the world and how fortunate we are in comparison. So Year 10, that comes to the end of our first poetry lecture. The nature of this lecture is that you can go back and you can re-listen to each stanza, and you are able to then make the annotations in your anthologies. As a reminder, what I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to make sure that you have got at least 3 annotations per stanza. You're welcome to re-listen to each one, and also note that on each slide I have briefly made a note of what we have said in the wider annotation. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you have enjoyed the lecture today, and we'll look forward to doing a few more of these. Remember that these are so useful for you. They're going to be giving you some pre-reading for each poetry lesson for the rest of this half term, and really utilise that independent learning and the use of technology that we've become so professional at over the last couple of weeks. So we will look forward to seeing you back in the classroom. Please make sure that you are bringing your annotations with you so we can see how well you have got on in this more independent lecture.